Changing is hard and there are risks attached to it. It requires funding. So learning in itself is not a sufficient pathway. The quickest way for a company to change is if they look at the benchmark, they see a best practice from someone else, they adopt it and they change.
Welcome back, everybody. Rich Baker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm speaking with leaders in the sustainability space about the work they're doing against the challenges they see in their community, economies, or in their general environment. For me, it's all about moving the next generation forward, sharing lessons, insights, experience, the work they're doing, how they're making progress, how they're measuring success. With that, in this episode, I'm extremely honored to be joined by Gerbrand Haverkamp, who is the Executive Director of the World Benchmarking Alliance. It was launched in 2018 because they believe there need to be a real change in the way that business impact is measured to boost motivation as well as to stimulate action for a sustainable future for everyone. So with that, Gerbrand, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. It's really great to have you.
Pleasure to be here, Richard.
All right, so as a starting point, an introduction to yourself and a little bit about the work of WBA.
Yeah, so my name is Gerbrand Haverkamp. I'm one of the co-founders and executive directors of the World Benchmarking Alliance. And like you said, we're an organization that, on the one hand, measures how the world's most influential companies are contributing or undermining progress on our global agenda. As you mentioned, the SDGs, but the same goes for the Paris Agreement, Global Biodiversity Framework. And with our stakeholders, we're trying to seek to hold business accountable for their contribution. And that's from the simple notion that if there's no accountability, there cannot be a reward for leaders and there won't be a penalty for laggards.
So I guess backing up a little bit, in your About Us, you say you believe there need to be a real change in the way that business impact is measured. What was it that you saw at the time, or what was the gap that you were looking at, or was it just everyone was off base? What was it that you were seeing, and how are you addressing that?
So I think for that, we have to go back to sort of 2015 when the UN Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. And from a multilateral perspective, that was revolutionary because it recognized that these goals could not be achieved if the private sector wasn't contributing. Now, that's nice to say, but then also quite a realization that these agendas were written for governments. So we first needed a translation of what these agendas would mean for business, like where was business expected to contribute and where did the responsibility kind of end. And the measurements at the time, there was a lot of, I'd say sort of two things. There was a lot of disclosure. So this was in the time of GRI, SASB. And there was a lot of measurement, but the measurement was primarily, with a few smaller examples, primarily done by commercial research providers doing this for the benefit of investors. So there's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't show the public how these companies are doing. So I think we're missing a big part of that. And they tend to focus a little bit more on the sort of what's financially material and less so on what's the impact of companies on people and planet, which from a sustainable development or a Paris or a global biodiversity framework is the primary interest.
For me, I guess that comes in at a really interesting time because there's a lot of benchmarks, a lot of standards, a lot of certifications, a lot of groups trying to make that translation, stimulate, motivate, inspire, provide frameworks. How do you, like, when you look at the work that you're doing, how difficult is it to, one, make that translation? Like, if you think about all these different groups, they're all trying to attack it. Like, is it just that difficult to make the translation, or is it more a matter of kind of showcasing the value after you've done the translation that's more difficult?
I think if you're referring to the number of standards, I think it is fair to say that it has improved a lot in recent years. So there are actually now less standards, and there's been quite a lot of consolidation compared to where we were sort of in 2015. So quite a lot of progress has actually happened. And I think on sort of the three domains, climate, nature, and social, we now see sort of we had the success of TCFD, and we have TNFD coming along, and now it's emerging TISFD. So it's actually becoming a pretty organized space. So for what that means for the World Benchmark Alliance is that in a way our work becomes easier, because the better the standards are, the higher the adoption rate of these standards is, the better the quality of the data is that we can use. So our work is really not to develop standards, but it is to translate these standards into a measurement for performance. So and then to show how these companies, on the basis of those that disclose data, how you can assess and compare their performance.
Now, the alliance. Who are the members of the alliance, and what are you trying to align?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So the members of the alliance is about over 400 organizations. So it's a mixture of financial institutions, NGOs, UN agencies, business platforms, consultancies. So that basically the entire sustainable business ecosystem is represented in the alliance. What we do with the alliance is initially the role of the alliance was a lot in helping us build the methodologies. So there were groups like Oxfam or investors or WWF or helping us. This is what we find important, and this is what we would like to see reflected in our methodologies. And to some extent, that they still do that, but over time they have become much more users of the data, right? So so what we do is we organize allies in, or they organize themselves in collective impact coalitions. Meaning that they use our data to engage on a specific topic with a specific set of companies.
Does that mean that you have a single set of data, a single methodology, you're aiming for a single level of transparency across this platform, or because you have so many different stakeholders involved and 400 different organizations involved, do you offer multiple modalities? Like how do you bring everyone together in a focused effort, I guess?
Yeah, so we have one methodology for everyone, right? So we don't create different benchmarks for different stakeholders, because we think it's really important also from the perspective of companies is that there is commonality in what society expects, whether it comes from investors or civil society. Now, of course, in real life, there is not that. They have different expectations, but we try to bring them together into one methodology. That does mean that different stakeholders will use different data, use different parts of our data, different parts of our benchmarks, put emphasis on different things, and we'll put and engage with companies on different things.
So the main effort at the end of the day is to move companies. When you talk about getting them to move, what are the best means of getting them to move? Is it like a name and shame ranking? Is it here's a tool set that we've all come together on? Like what are the ways that you find have been the most productive through your time so far?
We talk about like sort of as impact pathways, and the quickest way for a company to change is if they look at the benchmark, they see a best practice from someone else, they adopt it, and they change. And sort of that is how a company either use themselves in sort of or in peer groups or with the help of consultancy, and we can see that that's happening, and you can sort of measure the quicker sort of progress. Because changing is hard and there are risks attached to it. It requires funding or investments. So learning in itself is not a sufficient pathway for impact. So pressure is another important one, and pressure can come from investors, it can come from civil society organizations. So it can come from media. So it's basically who uses our data, finds our data useful, and is willing and able to bring it to companies to say, this is what we would like to see. But if you really ultimately want to change, you need to change the norms for that sort of underpin how we do business. And norms can be set by regulators, or norms can be set by standards, either voluntary or mandatory. So over the years, more and more of our work and emphasis has also gone to sort of the norm setting. Now, of course, WBA, the World Benchmark Alliance, doesn't set any norms. We can do so, but they don't mean anything to anyone. So we have to work with policymakers and standard setters to make sure that we set the right norms.
Now, some things you touched on, I would argue, require almost a perfect environment for real progress to be made, and one of those being, economic stability and transparency, and policymakers that are feeling confident and they're moving things forward. But I don't think we're in that time right now. So I'm curious, like, how do you see the current time affecting some of those, I won't call them aspirations, but some of those drivers that were helping you and some of those wins that were behind your back? Is it just that topics are kind of being left behind or left for later and others take priority? Like, how do you navigate this time? And are you seeing that some things are kind of falling off right now because, look, the economy is not great, we're not sure where the world is headed, and we have other concerns now?
So it's definitely a much more difficult space both for companies as well as for those that want to see companies change to become more sustainable. So definitely not a perfect environment to do this kind of work, but as it unfortunately is, it also makes it more important that you do it. I do think that the one nuance and caveat to this is I think that when we were publishing the benchmarks, people were always a bit sort of, when there was still a lot of tailwinds, people were always a bit sort of perplexed how poor the performance still was. And then so people always, like, when they saw a benchmark, sort of like a bit sort of disappointed, like, oh, is this still where we are? So yeah, for most companies, this is still where we are because our view is mostly dominated by those that talk about this a lot. But you can probably count them on, I don't know, let's say that there were sort of 20, 50 companies that dominated this agenda. And it gave us sort of this feeling that that was what business was doing. And we were also saying, yes, that's what those companies are doing. But if you look at the long tail of companies, that's not what's happening. I think we were too optimistic often then. And there is a similar risk that we're now a bit too pessimistic. So I think if we the sort of the change in narrative is a bit of an obvious point, but the change in narrative is much stronger than the actual change in performance.
I kind of take to the point that we were a little bit over optimistic before, a little bit more pessimistic now. I definitely look at the latter. I don't think that it's as bad as we say it is. I think a lot of it's gone into systems and process that we're not necessarily focused on because we've actually done the work, and it's, you know, like I keep saying, like the floor has been set higher and higher and higher, and so that long tail that we were saying wasn't really achieving much. Actually, I think through process it's achieving a lot, but they're just not talking about it. But I think the ceiling has dropped in terms of, say, leaders and the visibility of those who want to be leaders. And I'm curious, like, do you think that loss, and this doesn't, you know, align necessarily to your rankings per se, but like, do you think that the loss of, say, having those 20, 30 vocal companies is a problem if the floor itself is rising and the long tail actually is improving over time? Or do we still need to have those top 20 that we can all look up to and that drive everyone forward?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, Richard. I think particularly the leaders have become less vocal because you could argue everyone else was quiet already, right? So leaders have been less vocal, and I think in the long term that will become a problem. A way to think about this is that norms are set by leaders, and the rest has to comply afterwards. And so if the leaders are not willing, and it's mostly a case of able to lead, because they're not rewarded by their investors, they're not rewarded by a regulator that is willing to raise the bar, then you're gonna see a sort of a stagnation in the longer run in terms of setting new norms. So it's, you know, it's something that we can afford, if you want to use that word, for a little while. You can get through the sort of economic, or sort of through this down cycle, sustainability or economic down cycle. But in the end of the day, the world needs leadership. And if that is lacking for a sustained period of time, you will also see that there is less aspiration and less willingness to set norms for everyone.
Is it just a matter of, like, kind of switching gears and focusing more on those who are actually doing the work, and now we're actually measuring real work, and then so therefore long term we're not in a bad position? Like, I'm curious, like, how we're supposed to adjust to this.
Yeah, I think it's there is some element of adjustment, and I'll get to it. But I think before we go there, I think it's important that you also just keep doing what you were doing. There is a need to just keep going. Then the sort of if you go back to our mission to measure and to hold accountable, that doesn't change despite the environment. However, as you said, you can't ignore the world around you, certainly not. So what we've been trying to do with a few papers now is to sort of do a correlation assessment between, or sort of do an assessment between, are the companies that are leading on sustainability, are they paying a sort of an economic price for that in terms of growth or valuation? And the answer is no, they're not.
And so can I follow up with that real quickly and just ask, are there and I asked this of others, and I won't say anyone has a clear view, but did you ever look into the data to see, like, are there industries where actually outsized performance comes through sustainability, where there's other industries, like, actually those who did put in didn't make the money back? Like, is it like FMCG is a little bit more handicapped against, say, a business to business, where a B2B can, you know, they're building a factory, so having that sustainable investment that carries over 30 years of the life of the factory. Like, did you ever see anything nuanced like that?
Yeah, so the study I referred to looked at sort of 1,000 companies across multiple industries, but certainly I think your hypothesis is right. So if you look at the mining industry today, because of the quest for renewals and minerals, they have a sustainability sort of tailwind, right? They are part of um, they're part of the energy revolution. If we look at the other extraction, oil and gas, nothing is happening, right? So it would be weird. Like, I'm not going to argue that there's a business case for sustainability in oil and gas. There probably isn't, right? There is a case for the regulators or investors to step in, which they are not willing, right? So therefore we also don't. It's important not to overstretch the business case argument, right? Because if you say, well, if there isn't a business case, no one needs to do anything, then you're going to get stuck with industries like that, and who are going to, tip this or climate way over 1.5.
In that vein, if you look at the benchmarking, you look at the work you're doing, you look at these different industries, and I mean, you have such a spectrum. Do you think that there's areas that are still not being measured well? And is that just part of the process and we just need to get better with it over time? And are there areas that you think that we're not doing it well, but it's actually really critical that we fix that gap?
Yeah, so if you sort of think about if you try to simplify it into, we've got climate, nature, and social. I think we're getting pretty good at climate. Because we are able to do something which is quite essential, is that we are now able to measure capital allocation towards decarbonization efforts, right? So you can actually, as we call it, integrated transition plan. So you can actually see what the company is doing. So you can see how its actual emission trajectory is going, but you can also try to make a prediction about what you think it's going to be because of the investments in the R&D that are being put in. But that is kind of in a league on its own, because for nature, there isn't the equivalent of a single CO2 measurement, right? So nature impacts are far more disparate. It's land use, it's chemical runoff, it's water use, it's air pollution. Like, it's a lot of things that impact. So naturally, we're struggling more in that space to properly measure it. However, if you sort of look at the science, then decarbonization is as important as the restoration of nature, right? So we need to figure that out. And I think with groups like TNFD, Science-Based Targets for Nature, I think we'll make pretty good steps. But we of course will hit the fundamentals that it's never one. It's never all the equivalent of CO2, so that it will forever be. It is just inherently more complicated. So we should manage expectations on that front. I think then the third domain would be social, people, call it what you want. That is fundamentally something that we now measure through adherence to norms, right? Which is not a bad thing, because that is it's a very good thing. In fact, it's like, are you adhering essentially to the UN guiding principles for business and human rights, and how does that translate in your workforce, et cetera, et cetera. And we're pretty good at that. Like, we can measure pretty well how companies are adhering to norms, how that's being translated into policies, due diligence, grievance mechanisms, etc. So in summary, the social domain, we measure mostly processes, and we need to figure out how we measure outcomes.
Actually, I mean, the social one is the most problematic in my view. And I start off in social. I start off, I guess in this space, starting charities where we, put volunteers into work in cities. And I've often looked at, kind of the quality of life in a city as like my metric for sustainability as a starting point. And so actually, I mentioned this a few times in another podcast where I took the CFA exam last year, or I guess earlier this year. And, the book is like 580 pages or something long, and maybe 30 to 40 was S. The rest of it was E. I think you're right. We cover E really well. I think biodiversity, nature, that's coming in because it's very technical in many ways. Governance, very well covered, but the S side for me was super thin. And I was kind of thinking like, well, getting back to like why you guys started this, the SDGs, like, what are we doing this for? It's not just to cap emissions. It's actually like, why are we trying to cap it? It all gets back down to humans and the experience of individuals and social impact. And so I kind of find it interesting that the S is the challenging bit when that's actually supposed to be the focus.
Is we tend to measure these things as sort of separate. And well, it's useful to measure them in a separate because otherwise everything gets sort of blurred in an A or a B, and it means nothing anymore. So it's important to keep that separate. But we do need to be more sure that we kind of work towards. I talked about a transition plan earlier, but that is on the climate side, but that this becomes a more integrated transition plan, right? Climate, nature, and people, and because what you now see as sort of a reality, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but you'll see an oil and gas company with a terrible climate performance, but with the most terrific human rights policies and measurements, right? Because of course, investing in measurements and human rights, it kind of reduces your risk and it does not harm your business model. On the other side of the spectrum, you see renewable companies that are being litigated by local communities because of where they place wind turbines, right? So we need to be able as a sort of as stakeholders to form a more holistic view on what the transition of a company looks like.
The frameworks that are mostly being built are at a global level and seem to be very thematic and very technical process. But what you just mentioned, like once you get into local, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. That's where the separation happens. And I even think, like, from a social impact perspective, like if you're measuring impact to people, urban lifestyle is different than rural lifestyle. So like the impact of climate as you would measure it in a person that's living in Shanghai is very different than someone living in a rural countryside. So how easy is it to actually like agree on what you're going to focus on in that sense? Because you could probably develop deep rabbit holes that never end, and you would never have enough data to make it viable. But in a way, that's kind of the process that we're going through.
To say context matters and local matters, it's true, but it also opens the door to go into a rabbit hole you'll never get out. But I think it is possible to find a middle way. So let me give you an example, because we've been working quite a lot on that in recent years. Is living wages. Living wages are fundamentally local. There's something else everywhere, right? Because it matters within countries, so it matters. But we have made quite a lot of progress. Initially, a lot of civil society organizations developed methodologies to assess what a living wage is in Western Malawi or Chicago, or and now the ILO the International Labour Organization has standardized that work. So if you are a business, you can actually, there's a methodology and people that can work out for you where your operations and supply chains are and what the living wage in those areas are, and then you can measure the gap. Now, for us as a benchmarking organism, assessing the corporate, like, we don't have to do all of that work. What we need to do is say, okay, does the company commit to a living wage for its own operations, and by when? And does the company commit to a living wage for its suppliers, and up to which tier, and by when? Right. So that doesn't require us to develop a massively complicated methodology, because the groundwork has been done by others, right? So this goes back to my previous point about, because the numbers on human rights due diligence are much better, because we've had the UN Guiding Principles since 2011. So we've had investor pressure on it, media pressure, we've had regulation in some places. So like businesses have UN Global Compact, so a lot has happened on that sort of human rights agenda. But if it's not changing income, then are we actually improving lives? So that's the kind of outcome measurement that we need to get better at.
Well, and in that sense, I guess my question then comes to timelines. Like, what's realistic? Because yes, I mean, you're right. If you were Bangladesh and you doubled your wage right away, they'd go to Pakistan or something. But on the same token, is it also about the matter of timing, say within the industry or the country? Like, at some point they realize they've made enough, they can up it a little bit. They make enough. It's just like you have to time it right.
Specifically, like living wages is not something that you can achieve overnight, right? It's not something that you sign off in the board and then implement it the next year. In a way, it's not so different from moving to net zero. We're not framed to talk about, but that's also not something you can do overnight. So you need to, but it does matter that you commit to it and you put a target in place and that you start to allocate resources towards closing the living wage gap. We are used to talking about that in the climate space, very like, it's 2040, or I've got interim targets and I'm allocating some capital, but we're not used to talking like that in the social space. It's also, of course, pretty uncomfortable to say it's going to take me 10, 15 years to close the living wage gap. and those people now working for me just have to sort of deal with that. But if we don't, we're not actually getting serious about closing it. And I think this is where a lot of the companies, most companies that have a sort of serious sustainability departments have a pretty good understanding about what wages are being paid and how far off from the poverty line they are. But to talk about it publicly and to say we have this gap and now we're going to close it, that's pretty bold as an individual company.
There's a lot of uncomfortable truths, right? Like we're not going to be able to solve these things overnight. It does take a lot of multilateralism. I'm a huge believer in that, even if it's a bit of a challenge right now. We're more regional and we're separating because it's easier, but all those things kind of help and make progress. I feel like in some sense, yeah, even though now feels like a little bit all right, there's more headwinds now than there was 5 or 8 years ago, but we're still so far beyond where we were 15 years ago that I can look back and be like, okay, progress can be made. It's just not as quickly as you'd hope.
Absolutely, and I think the sort of the figure that's going around these days to remind people of that is that, of course, now there's a lot of criticism of the climate convention progress and how that's organized, and I think that critique is highly justified. But when it's then said as sort of, and that means we need to abandon multilateralism and we need to figure something else, then I think you're kind of forgetting the fact that we went from a 4-degree trajectory to now a 2.7-degree trajectory, and that everything that is, and the investments that went into batteries and solar and real, they're economic, but they were economic because governments chose to set the policies, and they would never have done that without a Paris Agreement. So I think it's kind of a cheap shot to say, oh, we don't need multilateralism anymore, because you kind of fail to recognize how much it has meant. And the human rights is sort of a similar example.
Well, and I'm going to bring that back to the work you're doing through benchmarking. Then, like, doesn't that make benchmarking more valuable? Because if there's a scientific approach and methodology, there's data, there's transparency. Doesn't that separate the signal from the noise in a way? Because I mean, in a way, I feel like the people who have opinions often don't have data, and it's very easy for them to express that and maybe even build a movement around it, or maybe even try and discredit those who have real platforms. But doesn't this, if you're doing it the right way, make the work more valuable?
I think it does. I think in this sort of day and age, it is extremely important that you can bring people back to something what might be, because of course we're still working out the methodology and tinkering stuff, but you're trying to get to a truth. And what we find is that often is quite difficult for both for parts on, if you want to say both, when we don't have aisles, but it's sometimes difficult for an NGO to reconcile that a company that they remember from their last great scandal has actually made some improvements. That's difficult because quite often the company hasn't fully acknowledged the scandal. It's sort of tried to brush on the carpet, but internally it actually started to do things differently, and suddenly they come up higher in a ranking. And then if your perception was the scandal from 5, 10, 15 years ago, that is a difficult. You have to reconfigure your truth. It's also difficult sometimes, at least it was for a while, for investors to realize that all their efforts to engage with oil and gas companies have essentially done nothing. That's also a difficult truth to recognize. It has done things on human rights and sort of environmental protection, but not in actually helping these companies decarbonize. So it's important for us to try and be that beacon, at least for some companies, to some stakeholders. But it's sometimes uncomfortable to reconcile yourself with that.
Now, earlier on, you mentioned that there's been a lot of consolidation in the industry, benchmark framework certifications, the whole gamut. How much of that, I guess, pre-consolidation contributed to some of this? That was like, it was very easy to kind of hide or to say things or to raise expectations. And then how does actually this consolidation, this maybe finding truth as an industry, help us move forward a little bit quicker?
I think the diversity in standards that you now still see comes from something that is deeper. It's not about we're a better standard or we've figured this out and they haven't. It's about we are trying to measure or to get companies to disclose what investors care about. And others coming from a different group of constituents and saying we are trying to measure, get a company to disclose what society cares about. And both come from this perspective that they have a different sense of what they like the responsibility of a business to be. I think we can be kind of, it can be frustrating, but I think we can all understand these differences, right? They're not reconciled by aligning indicators. They stem from a different view of what they think a company should be in this world.
But where do you see us going the next 5 to 10 years? Like, where's the moments of leverage that you see coming, and how do you map your own work towards those moments that you can then, like, look, we really made some progress on living wage, we really made some progress on this area. Like, what are some things that you're hoping come to bear over the next 5 to 10 years?
There'll be less points of leverage over the next 2 years, right? We will move through this. We will move through this cycle, and when we've moved through this cycle, then climate, nature, social, they will still stare every company in the eye. And I think most companies understand this, and that's why I think on a difference between narrative and performance, I think a lot of it will continue. Not at the rate that we need it to be, not at the rate that science says, but it will continue, right? We will figure something out. And when we figure it out and we get into 2030 and we have to agree on whatever comes after the SDGs, we need to be able to say, not only this is the role of business has a large role to play, but we need to be able to say, and this is the responsibility that we all understand business to have. And this is where the responsibility stops and that of states starts, right? So we need to, in this sort of downturn or this down cycle, we need to keep doing the work of trying to articulate what the responsibility of business is in today's world, where they have emissions larger than countries. So if we do not articulate what the responsibility of business is, especially large companies, we're missing a fundamental layer. So I think for our work, so yes, we have to adjust by putting more emphasis on the business case and showing that it is there, or at least countering the narrative that it's not there. And there's work on that side, but a lot of it is also trying to just keep doing the work, like keep improving methodologies, keep focusing the work on multilateralism, and eventually, that is my conviction, we'll get through this cycle.
And so with that in mind, if you were talking to sustainability leaders inside companies right now, as they keep doing the work, what are a couple things you wish that they would keep in mind or take reference from the work that you're doing at the Benchmarking Alliance, that they could actually make a little bit more progress? I feel like if the governments are kind of holding still, pulling back, consumers are holding still, pulling back, like they need something to move them forward. What are a couple pieces of advice?
Look, it's never my advice. It's never for me to advise someone else how to do their job, and they are in really, really difficult. Like every job is easy until you have to do it right. But I think it is important that at least within your own teams, and at least for your own realization, that what you do in the end of the day makes sense from an impact point of view, right? You may not talk about impact, you might call it something different, but if what you're doing does not lead to reducing emissions, if it does not lead to restoration of nature, if it does not lead to improvement of lives, it will not stand the test of time. That's not an encouragement for companies those leaders to just talk about impact and those kind of things, because that's not what the world wants to hear right now. So I understand you're pursuing different tactics, but I think for your own sanity and for the longevity of the intervention you're trying to do, this is what you need to keep in mind.